I do have to apologize as we start that I talked about gerrymandering being 8.4. It's actually 8.3. So 8.4 sections look at why states cooperate and why they compete with each other, and also looking at the issues of terrorism. So when we start class, we're going to have this conversation of why do states compete with one another, and what are they competing for? What are the benefits of that? What are the drawbacks? What should they cooperate for? What are the benefits? What are the drawbacks? And that's going to help kind of explain this section that we're going to look at. All right, whoops, and that kind of got away from me there with how that lined up, so I'll fix that when we go over in class. So, states when they are in competition, not necessarily war, but that could obviously be a very extreme case of competition. They're competing for controlling of territory. Think about, the Berlin Conference and imperialism and colonialism with all these examples. Access to trade and certain resources, so they want to control like diamond trades. They want to control certain waterways, canals, access to gold, access to who can trade with what country for what prices, and having influence over other states. Again, thinking back to the Cold War, when you have the, think about shadow belt regions here, where you have, Western democracies fighting with communist countries over, not necessarily, definitely in specifically countries, think about Vietnam and, the Korean Peninsula, but also over influence. Think about places like Iran, Syria, countries within Africa, South and Central America. There was definitely influence going on between various countries. Cuba, too, also really, really fits within that. So these are the things that states compete over, whether that is with money and trade, economics, political influence, and to the very extent of, or the very largest extreme, warfare. On the other side, what are states competing for? Not competing, cooperating. They cooperate to have security. All right, better protection against other countries, or that they view as threats. Increasing in trade, so being able to work together to lower prices, but also increase the amount of money or the amount of goods that they're trading, which would then, in turn, while the prices might be lower, offer more customers so you can make more money. And just other kind of mutual interests that they might have, whether that's travel, understanding of cultures, more free and fair societies, things of that nature lead to more cooperation. And historically, when we talk about the idea of security, we talk about things like balance of power. So this is when there's roughly equal strength between opposing states or alliances. So Europe has done this on numerous occasions. When one state gets too powerful, the other states rise up in opposition. So France in the age of Napoleon fits very, very well with that. You think, the alliances leading up to World War I and also with World War II, and the Cold War alliances that we're going to look at here in a slide or two. So this is when we see countries forming what we call supranational organizations. So opposite of what we talked about with the idea of devolution and autonomous regions, where, devolving power, giving it to more local levels and keeping that power within your own country, a supranational organization means you're giving up certain rights and powers and authority to work with other countries and to work cooperatively with them to achieve certain goals. And again, this could all connect itself back to economics, politics, cultural things, security. So yeah, there's kind of, some of your examples right there at the bottom. So those are things that states definitely cooperate and work together over. All right. Sorry that I'm laughing because of just how out of order this all became when I made some additions. I didn't even test it out first. So always try something out before you start recording. Anyway. So you can kind of see that for states are also competing to gain wealth, land, power, status, and allies. All right. So the United Nations is probably the largest supra-organization that there is on the planet, forming out of World War II. And so to kind of be this place, the precursor to this was the League of Nations that was designed, again, to prevent war following World War I. And so the United Nations is the second iteration of that. And there were high hopes for what it could accomplish. And obviously, as we've seen, it doesn't exactly prevent war, because the first time out of the gate, with the fact that you had, communism and democracies essentially going head to head in the Korean Peninsula down here, didn't really help matters. But the United Nations did step up and actually committed troops to protecting South Korea. One of the very few times where they've actually committed armed troops, not just peacekeepers, to an area. So you can kind of see all the countries on the globe that have been added over time. Western Sahara, it's still not a country, even though they've been working on that. If you looked at that article, good for you. But yeah, you can kind of see the ones that have been added over time. South Sudan, right in there too. It's really, really cool. Whoops, Don't know why I did that. So the United Nations is created again after World War II to be a place to solve and discuss international problems such as warfare, but also economic issues. What do we do during economic crises, health crises, human rights violations, humanitarian relief? So when people are facing famine or floods, earthquake disasters, when one country or a dictator or an organization is threatening or taking away human rights, massacres, genocides, committing atrocities, who steps in? This is a place for the United Nations and leaders in countries of the world to solve and discuss these issues. So, whether or not there's any value to that, that's up for you to decide, to think if the United Nations has done some things, if it hasn't done enough. It's all fair questions, especially when we talk about things like Rwanda, and the Balkans with Balkanization in the former Yugoslavia, within the Sudan and Darfur. I mean, there are definitely conversations to have in relation to, is the United Nations, doing enough around the globe, or doesn't even have the power to do enough? So there are things within that. Other sort of, related organizations that are connected to this or connected to it. So the WHO, World Health Organization, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, they all have similar things within it. Okay. So yeah, typically, peacekeeping or inspections, think about nuclear inspections, chemical warfare, those are things that the United Nations takes, more of a role in, rather than actual fighting. But again, it's a place to deliberate those issues and to try and prevent global catastrophic warfare. So, that's kind of its mainstream. And we'll revisit the whole thing about development with the United Nations and developmental goals for a better world. So it's going to come back within kind of that human rights and humanitarian relief and global economic issues. So gender rights are going to be something we're going to see, coming up in the next chapter or two. So looking more historically at, a more connected old version. So this section also talks about the Cold War in terms of supranational organizations, where, again, following World War II, you had the Communist East, as we've alluded to before, and the Democratic West. Okay, here's Yugoslavia being a communist country, but not part of, the Warsaw Pact, as it was known as, with these communist countries, essentially being controlled by the Soviet Union. So while they're independent countries, or some of them anyway, not Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Ukraine, they were not. But like Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, they were countries, but they didn't have sovereignty because the Soviet Union still could dictate a lot of what they did. So you had two opposing military groups. So you had the Warsaw Pact over here, and then NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that were working in mutual defense as sort of, again, balance of power, specifically along those lines in Germany, but also having issues and, discussions and a lot of events occurring within Greece and Turkey, especially after World War II ended. We also get some ideas of superimposed boundaries, again, going back to, the borders between East and West Germany, and then, just the West and the East, and then also within Berlin, too. And there's a nice little video on that if you have the time. So then we also have another supranational organization, more for economics, with the European Union. So the first members back in its first iteration, West Germany, not all Germany, because Germany was split at that time. Here they were in 1957, those 6 countries. And then it's obviously expanded out. Here was 2015. The UK had just voted in Brexit in 2016. So then you had candidate members of, Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Albania, Macedonia, and Turkey that tried joining. So when you look at today, okay, in terms of, where are the borders, so you have the additional states that have been added. Again, so you looked at Macedonia, Albania have been added. This is NATO. I apologize. This is the NATO on this side. So you can kind of see where is there differences. So here's the defense and political side. Here's the economic side. So the UK has left the EU. You have potential and still candidate states. The Ukraine also fits in there. I don't know why it's not. I mean, I know why it's not, but I don't know why it's not listed in here. But yeah, you can kind of see a lot of these countries overlap, but not all of them. Like Norway is part of NATO, but it's not a part of the EU, while Switzerland and Finland are. So again, I think that's worth considering. While, Bosnia, Serbia, Montenegro, they are wanting EU membership. But, they're not all a part of NATO. Neither is Austria or Switzerland, and Switzerland's not a part of the EU. So you think about the economic versus, the political spectrum or specter of this, because a lot of these countries, when you join a supranational organization, such as the EU, and we'll talk more about this, in the development chapter, it's for economic purposes. So they have open borders, which again, as we talked about with migration, way back in chapter 3, there are some issues with that because once you're in an EU country, you can travel freely essentially across the borders between the rest of the EU. There's no trade barriers between these EU countries. So there's no taxes or tariffs on stuff from when you're buying and traveling in between France and Germany. And that's part of what the UK didn't want to be a part of, because when these countries are struggling economically, the rest of the countries have to sort of pitch in. It's also explaining a little bit of why, when we talk about devolution, why Catalonia and the Catalans down here in Spain might want to leave, because when Spain's economy is doing bad, they're tied into it. So when the Greek economy was struggling and sort of has continued to struggle since 2008, 2009, everyone else in the EU sort of has to pitch in and help out, which not everyone wants. But that's the problem with supranational organizations, is you're tied into each other. Just like in NATO, if there's an invasion from Russia, the rest of the NATO countries have to join. It's also another reason why a lot of these former Soviet countries or Eastern Bloc countries, Warsaw Pact, communist countries, wanted to join NATO because they want to get away from the Russian influence. So hence why Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are trying or were joining, and why they still fear Russia today, and why there is work together, or why they work together for defensive purposes and conduct things like of that nature. It also helps to explain why Russia invaded the Ukraine and took why the Ukraine was invaded, why Russia took all this, including the Crimea. Because borders depicted as they are recognized by the EU, not by Russia, because of Russian aggression capturing this land, and essentially saying that they do not want Ukraine to join the EU or to join NATO for defensive purposes. But Ukraine is split between essentially the western part of the country that feels themselves more Ukrainian, that wants to be with the West, versus the Soviet Union, not the Soviet Union, the Ukrainians in the East, who view themselves more Russian and want to ally themselves with Russia. So again, that's kind of where these two examples also play in for economic and political purposes. All right. So in the final video for Chapter 8, we will talk about terrorism. So hopefully you can better understand supranational organizations and why states cooperate and also compete with one another at the conclusion now that we're concluding this video.